Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as we work in my plant nursery. So let's go. It is early September here in New Hampshire, and even though I have a lot of tasks, a lot of chores to do in my flower beds and in my garden spaces, I also have a lot to do here in my plant nursery. I often refer to this as my backyard plant nursery, but actually it's located up the driveway on the right-hand side as you approach the front of my house. Even though I've only had this nursery for a few years, I've learned so much. I've really tried to share a lot of my journey with you. I have a playlist that talks about my plant nursery. What I'll do is I'll put a link to that playlist down in the description below in case you're interested. I've spent the last number of days down here in the plant nursery, and I was down here this morning and I figured I might as well take you along and show you what I've been doing and what my plan is for this nursery as we look forward to next year. Part of selling plants is getting the material that you need. And I try to get the materials as cheap or as free as possible. One thing you're definitely going to need if you're going to have a plant nursery is some sort of soil or potting mix. I don't like to buy my own potting mix. That would get very expensive. And even though I could make my own potting mix, I actually can get my own compost for free from a local transfer station. And yes, it's mixed in with a bunch of other debris that I don't need. Sometimes there's trash in there, there are large rocks, there are pieces of wood. It's very easy for me to separate those pieces out. I can do it manually, or I have a sifter that Mr. Budget Gardener made for me, and I could sift all that material out. See this 5-gallon bucket? This is what I use to collect the dirt. And I just bring a whole bunch of buckets in my SUV, and I also have a shovel, and I just get to work. Sometimes Mr. Budget Gardener helps me, sometimes I go by myself, and I fill up a bunch of the buckets, and that's what I use for potting up a lot of my plants. Part of having a plant nursery is knowing and accepting that you will have losses when it comes to your plants. It's inevitable. Everyone has losses. The key is to minimize those losses and to figure out, why did you have losses? If you had a lot of losses with plants, what was the reason? If you just had some losses with plants, it's usually not a big deal. One year, I had a large loss when it came to hollyhocks. I realized that those hollyhocks that I planted were the annual variety. That's why they didn't overwinter the next season, and that's why there was a whole group of pots that just had dirt and nothing came up in them. Over here, these are some pots that have no plants that are alive in them anymore. It's such a small number of pots compared to the percentage of pots that do have plants in them. I'm actually relieved and okay to have pots that only have dirt in them. I view it as opportunity. I now will be getting free dirt. I will be getting a free pot that I can use for another plant, and it opens up space for me to put other plants in this nursery. So let's go ahead and collect some pots, and we're going to dump out the dirt and reuse that dirt. Small losses equal opportunity. Potting plants up is not a fun task. I'm not going to lie, but it is so important if you have a plant nursery. A lot of times, if you have plants that got too big, you didn't sell them during the growing season, it's really important to separate those plants, to divide plants. So again, it might be an issue, it might be a problem, but I try to view it as opportunity. I'm getting more free plants that way. All the plants that I have in my plant nursery were pretty much free to me. In other words, I didn't buy plugs. Yes, I might have bought seeds in a few cases, but in very few cases. Most of the plants in my plant nursery were plants that I divided from my own landscape. They were plants that I divided from other people's landscapes that where they didn't want certain plants anymore and they were happy to share. They were from plants that I started from seed, but the seed oftentimes were seed that I collected. So it was free to me. And I often like to start my perennial seeds using the winter sowing process. So I didn't even have to use grow lights. It didn't cost me hardly any money to do it that way. And then some of the plants were plants that I got from cuttings. For example, I have hydrangeas, and those were definitely plants that I got just by doing cuttings of them. Same with something like the roses that I have or Montauk daisy. Lots of plants you can propagate through cuttings. We talked a little bit about the potting mix or the soil that I'm using, but I actually want to talk a little bit about the pot. The first year that I had my nursery, I didn't know I could get free pots other than going on like Facebook Marketplace or asking friends. I found that I could get some pots that way, but not enough pots. I needed more pots. So I ended up buying them on Amazon. In fact, they were these ones right here. Of course, I didn't want to spend a lot of money because I really just needed the pots to hold some soil, to hold a plant, and then I wasn't going to ever see that pot again. Well, these pots are very flimsy. Yes, they were cheap, and that's why I bought them, because I didn't want to invest a lot of money in my pots. But they are very cheap, very flimsy. They can rip and break within one season. So I did spend a little bit of money initially when I bought those pots. But then I learned that you can get free pots that are basically to be recycled from local nurseries. So there is a nursery close to my house. It's actually on the way to where I go grocery shopping. So I literally pass it at least once a week. They always have so many pots. In fact, I went by there today and there were a ton of pots. So I was so happy to stock up on even more pots. But I have to tell you, when it comes to getting those free pots, by the way, this pot is broken. So I have a bucket here where I'm putting any trash material into that bucket. So when it comes to those free pots, one thing that I noticed, at least at this local nursery where I'm getting the pots from, was during the first few months of spring into early summer, they had so many pots, all different sizes. And what I did during that time was I stocked up. I got as many pots as I could. Now, I was looking for certain sizes because in my nursery, many of my plants are on the smaller size. They're 3-inch or 4-inch pots. So that's pretty much what I was looking for. And I stocked up heavily on pots. I stocked up heavily on things like these trays, which are great for moving plants around in the yard. I even stocked up on these type of trays, as well as cell packs, like 6 cell packs or 8 cell packs, which I can reuse for indoor gardening. So I stocked up heavily during the spring. But then what I found was during the heat of the summer, there weren't that many pots. There was definitely a decrease in all the potting supplies. So I was glad that I stocked up during the spring. And now that we are near the end of summer, I'm not sure if the nursery is getting rid of a lot of pots or what it is, but when I went there today, I got all of those pots that you saw earlier in the video. And I was so surprised. So definitely, check your local nurseries and see if they have pots, but don't wait until the potting up season, like right now. Don't wait until then, because there's a chance that you won't get your hands on any pots. You want to have those pots ready to go so that when it is time to pot up your plants, you have lots of pots already on hand and you don't have to stress about it then. One thing that's very important in a plant nursery is keeping those plants well watered. We absolutely had a very hot summer here in New Hampshire. And not only a hot summer, but it was a pretty hot and dry summer and very, very humid. So I did set up a sprinkler and I didn't have it on a timer. I think next year I'd like to have it on a timer. And I was running that sprinkler constantly, because when you think about it, these plants are in little pots. That means they're drying out very quickly. So that is very important. You want to make sure you're giving your plants plenty of water, because you don't want them to dry out and die. And it's a lot of stress on them if you're not keeping them well watered. And I do like to water them nice and deep, just to make sure that they have a nice drink of water, especially when I've just potted them up. I have a trench that's dug here, and I'm just placing all my plants in this trench. Then what I'll end up doing is pulling in the dirt on either side of the trench, and in the middle, all the pots are basically huddled next to each other, nice and tight. This is called healing in. I'm healing in all these pots so that during the winter months, they will be very well protected. Because when you think about it, you have a pot here, it's a small pot. If I just left this out in the elements during our winters, it gets very cold. It gets to be about -15, -20 degrees Fahrenheit. And all of the roots that are in this pot are basically exposed on all sides. That is not very good for this plant. Whereas if this plant was actually planted in the ground, you can understand that now the roots are protected with the soil, because the ground does freeze, but it only freezes down to a certain point. But regardless, it is so important to protect the roots of all your plants. And so healing in the pots is very, very important. So if you have pots of plants that you didn't get in the ground, winter is coming, you definitely want to take your pot, and you can put it in a raised bed. You can put it in your vegetable garden. Just make sure that you're getting a good amount of that pot into the ground, into the soil, and leave the top part of the pot though exposed. You don't want to just cover it fully. You don't want to plant this too deep. Just deep enough, as deep as the pot is tall. That's as deep as you want it. One thing that I'm doing differently in my nursery this year is I'm basically blocking the plants. When I say blocking, I'm creating little sections, little blocks of the plants. I didn't do that in previous years. In previous years, what I did was I basically made columns that went down with the plants like that. And that didn't work out very well, because when you think about it, you might have had a whole bunch of short plants down here in this one column. But then one section over, you might have had a taller plant that was now covering the shorter plants. So I'm doing something different this year, and I'm just going to call it blocking. I'm just creating little blocks with my like item plants so that they're all the same height, or generally the same height. I'm trying to set realistic goals for myself, because this is a huge undertaking. Redoing my whole entire nursery, potting up as many of the plants as I can, dividing the plants that are in the nursery, adding new plants into the nursery. So I'm really trying to divide my tasks into small, manageable tasks each day, depending on how much time I have. So today's task has been to tackle all the iris plants, because I knew I had a lot of time today to work in the nursery, and I have a lot of iris plants. So that's all I'm working on today, are just the iris plants. And if I don't get to all of them, it's okay. I'll continue with the next time. But my goal is to do as many of these iris plants as I can today. You can see that this plant really needs to be potted up. The roots are coming out of the pot, and that's not good. And with this plant here, well, it started with one plant and now it has two plants in there. So we can divide that and put it in a taller pot. And, well, look, this iris right here, nothing survived. Again, I don't view it as a loss. I view it as opportunity. We have some soil and we have a pot. One thing that I learned about my nursery this year was that people keep buying. They don't just buy during the spring months. They buy during the summer. It might slow down when it's like really, really hot. But as soon as the weather cools down, people start buying again, because they're preparing for next year's gardens. By the way, I thought that there was nothing alive in that pot, but there is. It's a small little tuber here, or rhizome for an iris, and there is growth coming out of it. That's all right. I am removing all of my iris plants out of these pots, and I'm actually just putting them in a pot that's a little bit taller. I think it's better for the roots of the iris. So, and I want all of my plants to be the same size pots, because it just makes it easier in the nursery. And I was able to get my hands on so many of these kind of pots for free. So why not, right? So as people continue to buy plants, which is wonderful, I'm loving that. I really appreciate the local support. What happens with my plants that are in their nice tight blocks is things shift around. And that's all right. As I sell plants in a block that has been completed, I just move plants around. And if I need to add more plants of the same kind into that block, I can, because I can shop my own yard and divide a plant or two. Or I can just shift around plants and add a different plant, a different variety of plant, whatever I need to do so that there's no gaps within my blocks. And this is what you want to avoid. You don't want your plants to have roots coming out from the bottom. So it's a great time to be potting up these plants. And my nursery doesn't have that much space in it. If I was to take this pot and put it in a much larger pot, let's call it a trade gallon size pot, that would take up a lot of room in my nursery, and I don't want to do that. So for that reason, I'm putting these type of iris in just taller pots, and I'm dividing the iris so that that helps in terms of space with the roots that are in each of the pots. One thing that I have been doing while I've been working on the iris is I've been cutting them back because we don't need all this top growth. We only need a small amount of the top growth so that it keeps feeding the rhizome. So I've just been cutting them back. Often you'll hear people say to cut them in a fan shape. That's more for aesthetic reasons. It does help the plant so it doesn't fall over during the wind also. So oftentimes you'll see that I am cutting my the fans of my iris in a fan shape fashion. And then I have a bucket right here where I'm putting any debris that's left over, and that can just go right into my compost pile as long as it's not diseased. I waited a while to do anything in my nursery of this type of nature for a number of reasons. It was very, very hot during the summer. I really didn't want to be disturbing the roots of all these plants during the heat of summer. Also, I was just busy with plant sales. I was busy with my own gardens. I have a lot of flower gardens, so I was tending to those. But now that the weather is starting to cool down, I figured it's really a good time to be doing this. You also don't want to be waiting too long to do a project like this because it depends on how many plants you have in your nursery, but also I want these roots to establish themselves well before we get a hard freeze. We'll be getting frosts within probably the next month or so. We should get our first frost. But I'm not worried about that. It's more about the hard freezes. I want to make sure my nursery is all set well before that time. A lot of times with iris, you don't want to plant them too deep. But in these pots, I do the best that I can with not planting them too deep. But I have so many iris that if an iris was planted a little too deep and it's not going to bloom for me next year, I'm okay with that. So we were able to divide that iris from one big iris into two smaller iris. It's in a little bit taller pot, and you can see the roots are not coming out from below it now. So that's a good thing. One thing that I am not great about, and I'm not sure if I'll ever be great about, is labeling my plants by the color, let's say. All my iris are mixed. So I have no idea what their colors are. And honestly, not every iris that's in my nursery will bloom next year. Because I'm dividing them, there are going to be many that don't bloom next year. So once they do bloom and I see what their colors are, I'll first check to see if I even have that iris in my own landscape. Because some of these iris I don't even have in my own yard. So if it's something that is very pretty and I don't have that same iris in my yard, well, I'll go shopping in my own nursery and put that iris in my landscape. But if I do see that the iris are blooming and I have that same iris in my yard, then those are the ones that I will sell next year. It's a great time of year in the nursery to be weeding the walkways or the pathways, to be weeding out the pots because weeds do appear inside the pots. This one's not too bad, but you can see the root is coming out of it. And again, the goal for me is I'm just trying to put these in a different size pot that's taller. And all of these pots that I'm putting aside, they can be used for a different type of plant that maybe doesn't have such an extensive root system to it. I found that not only the blocking should work with blocking similar plants together, but also putting plants in the same type of pots is also a good idea. Because the last few years, I just used whatever pots I could get my hands on. So sometimes it was a larger pot, sometimes it was a smaller pot for the same type of plant. And now I would prefer, if possible, to have, let's say, all of my iris in pots that are all about this size. It just makes it easier for healing them in, to be honest with you. When you're healing in all the plants, it's just so much nicer if they're all the same height, if all the pots are the same height within that trench. This one here looks like we should be able to get 3 divisions off of it. When it comes to the roots, I'm usually just keeping the roots on the plant, but if you wanted to, you could trim back the roots because the roots also take up a lot of space in those pots. So you can absolutely trim your roots back at this time if you wanted to. I wanted to show you close up that there are 3 possible plants right here that were in that pot. Now is a great time to go ahead and divide this plant. And if you look at the back, you'll notice that there are roots on the center plant there. And if you look carefully, there are roots on this little tiny plant over here, as well as on this tiny plant on this side. And all I'm going to do is I'm basically wiggling this plant here off from the mother plant. And I'm trying to be as gentle as possible. And with that wiggling, I'm able to pull this plant off from the mother plant. Let's go ahead and do the same with this one here. And now we have 3 plants that we can pot up in 3 pots. It's actually very satisfying doing this project, I feel. I was feeling a little overwhelmed. I'm not going to lie. I was definitely feeling overwhelmed, but I'm feeling better about it now. Now that it's been a number of days and the process has begun of potting up, I'm feeling better about what I'm doing here. And I know that come springtime, when it's go time everywhere, out in my flower beds, in my vegetable garden, and in my plant nursery, that the plant nursery will be in much better shape because I spent the time right now to do what I'm doing. The other thing that I usually do that I haven't shown you is I like to basically take the pot and on the pavement here, I'll just go like this. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm trying to take out any air pockets that are down in here because the soil will definitely settle over time. So I'm making sure that I'm taking out any air pockets, and then I can just add a little bit more soil to the top after I've done that. The last thing I wanted to go over with you was winter sowing. As many of you know, I love to winter sow. I love to collect my own seeds. And I use winter sowing for starting all my perennials that way because many perennials need what's called a cold stratification period. And when you winter sow, those plants are automatically getting that cold period outside during the cold winter months. Since I've been doing the nursery for a few years and since I've been winter sowing for a few years, I've learned something. I would prefer to winter sow plants that I can't easily get my hands on for either my own garden or for my plant nursery. So, for example, iris. If there's an iris that I don't have that particular color or that particular type of iris, then I might as well winter sow it if I'm able to get my hands on the seeds. But if it's an iris that I have in my landscape and I have a lot of, it's really for me not worth it to winter sow that plant when I can easily divide the plant from my own landscape. So like obedient plant. I never had a purple color obedient plant. And I was able to get the seeds of that plant from a friend of mine. And I winter sowed those seeds. I got a lot of plants that way. And those plants are now going to seed. I could definitely collect the seeds and winter sow that plant again. But I don't have to do that because now I have so much of that plant from winter sowing it previously that I was able to divide and pot up those plants very easily. And when you winter sow perennials, usually the plants won't bloom for at least 1 or 2, maybe even 3 years when you start a plant from seed. So I would prefer to divide plants when possible. But absolutely, I will still be winter sowing and I will still be collecting perennial seeds, but I'm just going to be selective about it. I'm not going to winter sow plants that I can readily get from my own landscape. Now you know what I'm up to. What are you up to? I'm sure you must be doing something in your landscape, or maybe you have a nursery and you're busy doing something in your nursery. I'd love to hear from you because I can't be alone, busy right now, trying to get ready for the winter months. And I figured it was nice to just show you what I've been up to in terms of my plant nursery. There is so much more to be done with the nursery. This is just a small snapshot in time. I'll definitely make more videos just to keep you updated with what I'm doing in terms of getting ready for next year and selling plants. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them down in the comment section below. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.